Hello, good afternoon, good morning. If any of you use Twitter, that's my handle there, and you can tweet me things. If you have questions later, please feel free to post them, and I'll get around to answering them. I work for N26. I'm the CTO there. For those of you that don't know us, we're a challenger bank based in Berlin in Germany, and we're really trying to disrupt the way that people think about banking. So we like to think that we're a technology company first, working in banking rather than a traditional bank. A really good example of this is our recently launched Space, where you can actually sort of drag money from one space to another. Very different way of sort of managing money. And from a technical perspective, we're very proud of the platform that we've built with being able to do more than 120 deployments per week. So this means as a bank, we can actually move very rapidly. And as a CTO there, some of the things that I'm looking out for that you can talk to me in the breaks about are things like how do we evolve our architectures over time. I'll be talking about the sort of second book that I published called Talking with Tech Leads. And for us also, learning and continuous improvement is a really key thing of keeping nimble as an organization, and that's where retrospectives are really key from my sort of personal practice. We are also hiring, so we have offices in Berlin, Barcelona, and New York, if anyone is interested. But the point of this talk is really to talk about talking with tech leads. And one of the reasons I want to sort of talk about this theme is that I've been working in technology for more than sort of 17 years. And I've helped a lot of people learn what it means to be a sort of technical leader. So in the sort of book that I authored, it was 2014, I had interviewed a lot of different people who are on the journey, or who've been on that journey of leading technical teams. And these are some of the lessons that I wanted to sort of explain and sort of share with you in today's talk. Another sort of side of this is actually working with my previous employer, where I developed a sort of global training program for tech leads. And also coaching and developing and training them so that they're more successful. And I've also run sort of tech lead courses, so I've trained more than a sort of 150 people around the world personally on this particular journey. And it's this journey that I sort of want to take you all on today, really. And what I want to sort of start off with is sort of the archetypical story of people who've gone on this journey. Now, some of you in this room are probably people who've been tech leads or still are playing tech lead roles. Maybe some of you are still sort of about to embark on this journey, and we'll find out maybe what awaits you. We'll also explore in today what I mean by a tech lead, and there's lots of different explanations of this. Naming is hard in our industry. And I want to sort of share with you some of the surprises and struggles that people have when they first step into this role, and sort of finish off with a couple of tips for being what a great tech lead could be, and adding some tools to your toolkit that will make you much more effective as well. Along the way on this journey, we will also explore some of the lessons learned, and these will be sort of 5 key lessons that I'll be highlighting in sort of blue along the way. But let's first kick off with really trying to understand what is this archetypical story of how people move into this sort of technical leadership role. Now, typically, like most of you here, we all have some sort of engineering background, and my story actually begins like this as well. Sort of you get really great at caring about code craftsmanship, you care about building systems, you want to have more impact, you start to learn a lot more about sort of architecture and design patterns, and then at some point, there's this kind of turning point, and maybe there are 2 different paths. Maybe one of them is an internal drive of saying, actually, you know what? I want to be promoted. I want the next step up of responsibility. Perhaps the second one is really about saying, well, somebody thinks that you could be ready for this tech lead role, and they ask you to step into this new role. Now, as maybe a developer that's gone on their particular journey, this is kind of exciting, right? So it means more seniority. It means doing something with more impact. But one thing that I've learned along this way is that a lot of people see it as a sort of step up in the career ladder. And this is really, really far from this particular truth. And this is something that you should avoid thinking about. Now, what happens when people go on this journey, they start being a developer, and then they're suddenly sort of christened with this title, tech lead, then they start to realize, oh, what am I supposed to be doing? What is it that this role actually entails? And this is really lesson number 1 on this particular journey, is that this tech lead role is not a promotion. It's actually a role change. And this is what you need to have as a mental model switch about how you approach what you do, how you reward yourself, in order to be a really successful tech lead. Now, I talk about a bit of a career ladder, and I want to sort of step back onto this. So we've been building one of these things in a sort of hypergrowth company, adding more clarity.
For those of you that aren't familiar with this concept of a career ladder, it's normally something that sort of describes different types of roles at different levels and the behavior and perhaps the impact associated with it. And there's a couple of few key tips that I've learned in using career ladders. So the first thing is, it's not really a sort of checklist. So it's not something you say, I've done all these things, therefore I'm ready for this kind of role. Instead, it's really this guide for a conversation. So one of the interesting things that I'll repeat is that people are unique, people are different, they have different strengths. And this means that people don't fit into these boxes perfectly. And it also means that people can be effective at these roles with impact in different levels. And one of the reasons that we have career ladders in a lot of organizations is it helps to introduce expectations. It helps to reduce systematic bias about what does this role entail. And this is where I want to sort of go back to understanding, well, as an engineer, what does your journey look like? You sort of start off maybe as a junior or as some sort of intern, and then you develop experience, you become a lot more independent as a sort of software engineer. Maybe you're even leading the design or build out of a particular independent application, and you're sort of starting to teach and mentor, and this is maybe what is kind of associated with a senior engineering role. And then there's this role that suddenly magically becomes sort of a tech lead. Now, it's kind of interesting if you look towards America. They talk about two different tracks, about having two different paths for people. So one which is about an individual contributor track, about people who want to stay coding, and then one which is really about a management track, which is around sort of impact around the sort of organization. I would argue that actually there's not just two tracks that organizations should be building. And this is something that we're currently going through the process of establishing at our company. Rather than two tracks of individual contribution, we're really talking about a three-track model. This is what I call the trident model. So you really do have an individual contributor track, and I won't really be focusing on that too much. But the big key shift that I talk about with technical leadership and going on this journey is that it's actually a very different role and a very different track that requires different skills. Just like management is actually quite different from writing code. Leading technical teams is actually quite different as well. And so what this means is that when you go back to your career ladders, what you should really be thinking about is not a step up in the career ladder as a promotion, but it's really a side step into a new sort of track. And the question is, what skills and experiences and tools do you need to be successful at that? Now, if I describe each of these different roles, then I would really be thinking about, say, an individual contributor spending about 70 or 80% time sort of executing and doing things as an individual. So what this means is, things like designing, things like writing code, things like debugging. These are typical sort of activities. And of course, even as developers, you know this, you don't write code 100% of the time. You still have to be sort of communicating with people. You still have to be designing and thinking about things, conceptualizing. Now, if you think about management, this is kind of if you spend the majority of the time there, you're thinking about managing the system. So this is where you're sort of supporting and growing people in the environment. You're thinking about planning and how do things sort of relay to what was sort of planned and what's currently in progress, trying to unblock things as they go. You're often thinking about sort of budgets and dealing with limited resources. So how much money you have, how much can you spend, how much can you burn. And then things about sort of organizing, so trying to make sure that everyone has as much access to autonomy and alignment as possible to make everyone as effective as possible. And so those two tracks are very different from what I call the technical leader track. And this track is really focused on leading technical topics and teams. And this is kind of an interesting sort of mix of different skills. You need to have a technical background. You can't just have general management skills. And you also need to be able to have good, strong leadership skills. So, a lot of the work involved in this is really about sort of aligning the team of individual contributors to make sure they're working towards the same sort of direction. Managing technical risk and making sure that, we're not just hacking away without thinking about the quality that we build into the processes. One thing is often really making sure that people understand what is the sort of technical vision of what we're trying to build. Which system architecture are we aiming for? Is it a structured monolith or is it microservices? If so, how do we actually build that? We're also thinking about tech debt management. So when do we take the time to double down on debt? And when do we actually pay back some of the debt that we actually choose? And another key thing about technical leadership is really about making sure that knowledge is continually transferred. As you all know, in today's world, you can't be an expert at every single stack. You can talk about infrastructure, DevOps tooling, you can talk about back-end engineering, front-end, iOS, mobile, Internet of Things. It's very hard for us to be sort of knowledgeable about all of them and be effective. So we have to work together and we have to share knowledge. And that's kind of one of the roles of what a technical leader is effectively doing. So for those of you that have been on this journey and then those of you who are about to start off on that journey, one top tip and a big shift is really thinking about what got you here won't get you there. And that means the skills that you developed as an engineer aren't really preparing you for this role. And you need to think about, well, what are those skills that you need to have? So that's maybe the archetypical story about how people come into this role. Let's talk about what I mean by a tech lead. So my definition of what a tech lead is a software engineer, so somebody who is technical, responsible for leading a development team and responsible for the quality of its technical deliverables. So as an engineer, you're probably responsible for a certain feature in there. But as a tech lead, you're responsible for how well everyone is working together. So, if everyone is working in individual silos, then, you'll probably end up with lots of different individual imprints in the code base, which make it harder to maintain overall. So you're sort of responsible for the quality and how well the whole group is delivering. If I think about the balance of skills that you need to be effective as a tech lead, I often draw this sort of circles of responsibilities. And there's a link here where I detail about what skills in each of these bubbles that you need to develop. But here is where you need to have some experience in developing and engineering. You need to have some experience with sort of architecture skills and the sort of the bigger picture, thinking about systems and not just software. But also you need to have leadership skills. So lesson number 2 for all of you here is that the tech lead role requires and demands technical leadership skills. And this is where you have to ask yourself, how do you go about building these when you're actually working as an engineer? Now, I know this from my own personal experience is that, we're all passionate about learning new technologies, tools, how to be more effective. And so if we look at sort of the time spent and the experience that we accumulate, we spend a lot of time developing engineering skills. Maybe along that path, we start to learn about design patterns, architectural patterns, enterprise integration patterns. We learn a little bit about architecture, but maybe not enough of what we need in order to sort of play this role. But how many of you in your organizations are rewarded for developing leadership skills? Probably not a lot of you. And this is where I really ask companies to think about if they're putting people into these roles, what support are they giving people of developing these kind of leadership skills that will make them effective? So how to shift this? So there are 4 steps that you can start doing. The first one that I always like to get people to know is really about awareness. So people have to know that these skills are important. The second point is really about training. So you need to not just tell people, here are things that you need to develop. You have to also give them the tools that they can start to practice and develop an understanding about what leadership skills actually mean. Now, sending people to training courses doesn't mean that people develop those skills automatically. We know this from certification. And this is where coaching really comes into play, coaching and mentoring. So how much sort of feedback are people getting on the job, in the play, of developing how effective they are? How much support do they have in understanding how to be more effective? And the key 4th point for all of you here is really making sure that you practice this thing deliberately. So we all know through sort of software craftsmanship, deliberate practice is a really key thing to developing skills in any area, and leadership skills are no different. It requires some diligence, you have to sort of focus on this, and then you can get better. Now, the big shift that comes when you're sort of moving into this role is you normally focus on this kind of corner over here as a developer. But actually, when you move into this role, you need to be focusing on developing awareness and skills in the other 2 areas to make sure that you're balanced out and that you're going to be effective in what you're actually doing. Now, this is a bit of a struggle because as a tech lead, you kind of sit across 2 worlds, right? You sit around both the leadership side and both the sort of engineering side. And one sort of question that I often get is, well, how much time do you spend coding if you're in this sort of role? Now, there is no perfect solution, but a rule of thumb that I like to sort of give advice for is really to think about sort of this amount of time minimum, so about 30% of your time spent with the code. So if you're spending 80 or 90% of the time writing code, there's probably a whole bunch of responsibilities you're missing out on, and you're dropping and ignoring in favor of coding. And that's really easy to understand because it's kind of what you were sort of rewarded for when you were an individual contributor. But in a sort of tech lead role, you're rewarded and judged on something different. So a really good test of seeing how well you're doing at this is really thinking about how well does the code base look like it was written by a single person. So it'll never look exactly perfect, but if you sort of squint and you look at the structures and the patterns, you'll start to work out how similar they are, or maybe how different they are across the different places. And how well this is sort of shown by this sort of single person look shows you how well aligned your team is in thinking in the same ways and trying to approach problems in a consistent manner. Now, I don't have time to talk to you about all the skills that you can possibly develop in building leadership skills. Here are just some of the few. The great thing is that we're not the only people who've gone on this journey trying to understand what it means to develop any of these skills. Now, for any of you that want to understand how to get better, this is now the time to take a photo of lots of different books. And this is really just the tip of all of the different sort of things that are out there that you can tap into. So leadership skills, the fortunate thing is that everyone struggles in every field who go through this shift. So I know doctors who go through this sort of process of moving into a leadership role, and they have the same similar experience. You have people that are used to doing their single sort of task or domain, and then they have to lead people, and their organizations don't prepare them for them. But here's a whole bunch of books that I would recommend, and I've personally read all of them and highly recommend each of them for giving you a sort of bang for buck in developing leadership skills. And there's a quote that I really love, which is, reading is still the main way that I both learn new things and test my understanding. And this is an interesting quote because this is actually coming from Bill Gates only 2 years ago now. And so even somebody as successful as Bill Gates, who's been founder of Microsoft and lots of other sort of initiatives, for him, he's still continually learning. And I think this is the exciting thing about all of us, why we get into engineering. It's because we get a buzz. And I think this is the big shift, is that you can also still continue to learn in your leadership journey, but what you learn about is a little bit different. So lesson 3 here is really about benefit from many resources on leadership, but be sure to make sure you practice. So there's no use accumulating wealth of knowledge without actually putting it into practice and seeing what actually happens. So we've understood maybe how people get into this role. We understand what I mean by this role. So if you're playing this role for the first time, there's a whole bunch of struggles and surprises that you'll encounter. And this is what I found really consistent talking to people in the sort of interviews for the book, but also during the courses that I run. And this is what I sort of want to highlight. And I want to talk about 3 particular surprises and struggles that people had. And if you've played this role, you probably know what I mean. So the first one is really this kind of shift of when you're sort of moving from a developer where you're sort of surrounded by other developers that you can sort of talk to people with, that you can problem solve. When you step into this role, you're suddenly feeling like you're on the corner up there. And so this is often this feeling that you're a little bit alone. So you're the only person that's doing this sort of thing. Now, it feels like you're sort of now an outsider. You can't necessarily share issues with everyone in the team. There's some topics that you feel like you need to address, but you don't necessarily have anyone that you can sort of bounce ideas off. And you know, you're no longer a whole collection of developers, you're actually the single tech lead on the role. So by definition, you're sort of a single point of failure. And this is kind of a nature of the role, is that sometimes you have to act as a shield of information of what's coming in, and that sort of also filters and protects the sort of team. Now, what's kind of interesting about this kind of feeling of alone is that it's a very common thing with a lot of people who step into this role. And it's a common thing with anyone that plays a leadership role, is that there'll be particular struggles that you have to deal with that nobody will sort of be there to help you work out how to solve. The sort of second surprise that a lot of people struggle with is this kind of picture that I have with a lot of different directions. And I think this is how I like to sum up the idea about uncertainty. So as an engineer, one of the interesting things that we're really focused on is really fast feedback cycles about certainty. So you know, when we actually write tests, we get immediate feedback about, is this thing working red or is it green? Is it working? And one of the things about leading is that there is no right answer. Sometimes you don't know if it's going to be the right, perfect solution. And one of the things that you sort of develop as a habit through being an engineer is this whole thing about one or two answers. So it's this binary kind of habit. And often when you step into the role of this kind of technical leadership role, how do you resolve a conflict between two people disagreeing about a technical solution? There is often multiple solutions and approaches to actually dealing with it, and not just one right answer or just two options. And the other struggle with sort of dealing with this kind of role is often things about having imperfect information. So we listen to what everyone's having around, what are the issues that people have, you collect data, but we have to make a judgment call at the end of the day, given imperfect information. And this is a real sort of big struggle a lot of people have of, am I doing the right thing? Is there a right answer? And I'll tell you, there isn't always the right answer. It's the question of, is it good enough for moving things forward? So the third thing that really surprises people, and this is probably the one that most people struggle with, and I've kind of depicted it with a snowflake, is that it represents people, because everyone is a little bit unique. And one of the big learnings for a lot of people in this is that people are puzzling. So everyone likes to think that everyone will act how they would act. But actually, one thing that you'll find out over time is that people have different preferences. People have different strengths. And that makes them unique at approaching problems really differently. Over time, once you start to engage with lots of different people, you'll learn about different models of how to deal with it. But what I would be careful to sort of say is you need to use them as sort of archetypes, not stereotypes. And what I mean by that is that you'll notice these patterns of how people might behave, but it doesn't mean that people will always behave consistently. So we are all human at the end of the day, and we all suffer, and we all sort of benefit from emotions. And I think that's one of the biggest struggles that a lot of people have, is that when you deal with a computer, you can program a computer, and it does what you want. And a lot of people think you can apply that to people, and I can tell you it doesn't work. So these are some of the struggles that a lot of people who've gone on this journey have had. And I think these are one of the interesting things that are a consistent theme in all the sort of talks that I have with people who move from being this engineer to a tech lead role. So lesson number 4 here is really taking comfort that others have already been through this journey, and more people will be on this journey. And this means that other people have solved these problems, but also struggled with these problems as well. So there's a whole wealth of information out there about how you deal with this. So there's a lot of information about how you can learn more about people, you can learn more about how people have different preferences and communication styles, and you can benefit from that as well. So, we're lucky because we live in this sort of connected age where information is available all over the place. Now, my personal tip for you, if you're sort of struggling with this, is really making sure that you have some sort of support structure in place. So this means that perhaps it's a buddy that you call on all the time. Maybe it's a work colleague that works in a different department. Perhaps it's your manager who you can sort of ask for help and sort of bounce ideas off. If anything, I'd recommend actually building a network of different supporting structures so you get different perspectives of how people might sort of solve the situation. But it's really key that you have some sort of safety net to sort of catch you. So you can't have dealing with your own sort of issues and feel like that it's up to you to deal with it. You can tap into advice from others, people who've been on this, and get different perspectives of how you might deal with that. As we sort of head towards the end, I want to sort of talk about, what are the things that make a great tech lead? And I think this is one of the things that I really appreciate of sort of working with lots of different people over time and seeing people grow, is that I'll say that there isn't sort of a single way that you'll be a great tech lead. So I think this is where you have to work out what your individual style is and work out, how you want to live that through your own leadership philosophy. And what I want to offer you is really a couple of tools to add to your toolkit that you might consider how you actually become an even better tech lead in your sort of leadership journey. The sort of first thing that I sort of want to focus on is, to be a great tech lead, you sort of need to shift away from this individual contribution mindset to really thinking about how do you develop other people. And when people first step into this sort of role, one of the first things that you're sort of often taught about is thinking about how do you delegate. And being engineers, we like to think in binary modes. We often think about these two extremes. Well, either I tell people what to do, and this is exactly how they should do it, or I sort of delegate, and then I don't worry about the details. Now, over time, one of the things you'll learn is actually there's a whole spectrum of how you can actually engage with people. And this is what is called the situational leadership model. So one of the interesting things is definitely starting off with, perhaps thinking about how you might tell or break things down to very concrete sort of matters, all the way up to sort of building up to delegating. And if you're doing this right, one of the things in implementing the situational leadership model is that you're actually growing people in that same sort of process. So a really good example of where it makes sense to actually tell people is you have to think about perhaps the skill of people and how complex is that task that needs doing. So for instance, I don't really have much background in machine learning, and if somebody was to say, Patrick, can you set up some sort of machine learning algorithm to automatically scan pictures, whatever, I would like a bit more of a step-by-step guide. And we all do this when we learn a new skill, right? We all look at the 5 minutes quick start guide to using X tool. And this is actually where telling can actually help people if you understand where their skills lie, and they're motivated to actually learn. However, simply sort of saying to somebody, can you just go off and build this machine learning algorithm, might freak a lot of people out if you just delegate. And so you need to think about, depending on the person that you're working with, how do you sort of support them in sort of growing? Now, for some people, it's not necessarily about breaking a problem down into sort of step-by-step guides, but it might have to do about sort of engagement and motivation. So you'll notice this perhaps with people who are a lot more experienced, is that they can work out how to find that step-by-step guide. What they'd really like to understand is, but why? Why are we doing this? And this is where one of the steps along this sort of model is actually about selling the work. So if you have bright, intelligent people working for you, and I hope most of you are working with those sorts of people as teammates and colleagues, then they'll work out how to learn and where to go to find the step-by-step guide. And what they need to understand is, what's the value of me actually doing this task? And this is where you have to sort of work on your sort of motivation skills, try to help people connect how this task or this activity will add value to the overall organization. And after that, they can work out exactly what they need. But what they need is context. There's a really great TED Talk by Simon Sinek, and it's called Start With Why. And I think it's a really great leadership talk that talks about the golden circle of first starting with why and not with what. And I think when people are motivated and understand what thing that they're going to be contributing to, it really helps people really get engaged and will make you a lot more of an effective leader. Often what you think of is starting with what, other people have different ways of accomplishing it, but the thing that you need to provide as a leader is really about the why. The third step in the situation leadership model is really about participating. So sometimes there are complex, gnarly problems that you can't just simply delegate. And this is where actually you might need to take part in problem solving with people. So an example of this for me is we're working and building sort of a architectural guild as part of our sort of inner circle of trying to get some more alignment across the organization. Now, I could sort of delegate that, but nobody in the organization has done this before. And so one of the things that we want to do is I've got motivated people who are talented at understanding how to do this. But actually, by me sort of checking in and taking part and sort of asking, how are you sort of going? What is the plans? What are the struggles? What's the next steps? We can actually sort of problem solve, and we get to better results as a goal. And the people who are sort of nominally responsible for the task are also learning and feel supported along this way. And so with this model of the situational leadership tool, you can start to think about what is appropriate for the environment of what you have, based on the activity of what needs doing and the sort of background and skills of the people that you have. And this is a really great way of sort of building people. And once again, if you do it well, then you should be sort of telling less at the start of some sort of goal. And you should be able to delegate more over time because you've effectively grown people to be a lot more independent. And this is really the key to being a successful tech leader, is working out how do you scale. And through scaling, you don't do everything yourself because there's only a certain amount of time and there's only a certain amount of information that you can absorb. But if you think about rather than programming yourself, but actually programming through the rest of your team and helping them set themselves up to solve more complex problems, you have much more impact. And that's a really key, powerful sort of message that comes along with this model. Now, when you're thinking about these different types of modes that you take when you're acting in sort of leadership, there are a couple of things that affect that. So one of them that I've talked about is the skill, right? So if you have graduates straight out of university or some sort of programming profession, this is where you probably want to start earlier in the situation leadership model. You probably have motivated people, but they're not quite sure how to go about problem solving yet. They might forget about the testing, they might forget about the sort of clean code, and they're not even aware of it, but you can sort of make sure that you have clear expectations about how they achieve a task. But there's another thing about the motivation, which we've kind of talked about, in terms of, do people understand why this thing is important? But the third one is really about urgency. So, there are certain times in organizations or teams where there's crisis, right? So there's a production incident, something's gone down. That's not the time to sort of sit back and coach, right? This is where sometimes urgency is about taking action to create clarity. But the trick of knowing when to use these things is making sure that you don't abuse any of these tools in the wrong sort of context. So if you're telling people what to do all the time, that's probably not saying that you've sort of developed your skill at learning how to apply this. When the crisis is over and you still continue to tell people what to do, you probably aren't sort of acting properly as a leader, and you need to break out of those habits. And this is one of the sort of other skills that you develop over time as a leader, is being really aware about how your behaviors are impacting everyone else on the team. Now, another problem a lot of people have when they play this role is about time and where to invest time. Now, as a CTO, I manage my time very carefully. And in a role like a tech lead, it's also key that you work out how to manage your sort of time. Now, when you first step into this role, you probably have a whole bunch of people sending you invites to come to meetings, to give updates. You're trying to also get some coding done. It can feel really overwhelming. But the key to working out how do you scale yourself is really thinking about carefully, how do you spend the time that you have, given that time is limited? Now, a really nice sort of example of how you manage this is through this sort of table here. So classic consultant, the 4 quadrants. So they're split into urgent and not urgent, and then important and less important. So for the things that are urgent and important, so we need to restore service in a production outage. That is something you really have to take care of and invest the time to make sure it happens. But for the things that are important, but are never urgent, that means that nobody comes to you to ask you for these things to happen. These are things that you need to make time to actually do. So this is where you have to decide to make time in your calendar to make sure that you deal with the things that you need to deal with. So if somebody's coming to you and you're thinking about, do you want to deliver more features really rapidly, cut quality, take up technical debt? When do you invest the time to make sure you're thinking about how do you pay back that technical debt over time? How do you know when too much technical debt has accumulated that it's slowing things down? How do you know when the team is starting to lose perhaps information and you have sort of information silos throughout that? These are things that people expect you to do as part of your role, but nobody will ask you to make time to do it until it's too late. So for those things that are really important to your role and that aren't urgent, it's up to you to make the time to make sure that you think about these things and you have a way of actually dealing with them. Now, for the things that are less important and less urgent, this is where you can actually start thinking about how do you delegate things. So one of the reasons why it's important to sort of delegate this sort of stuff is that, often the quality of how something gets done doesn't really matter for things that aren't so important. So if somebody could execute at the quality of sort of 80 or 90% of what you could do, then you should delegate it immediately. So nobody will do things exactly the way that you'll do, and that's kind of one of those other things that you learn along the way. But what's really key is that you start to delegate those things that are less important and urgent as well. Now, for the things that are less important and less urgent, this is where this table is telling you to get rid of these activities. So some really good examples of this is if you check your email every 5 minutes, right? It's not like emails are going to disappear all of a sudden. If you're going to Facebook or Twitter or Slack, all of these distractions and interruptions, these are things that are not important and not so urgent. And you might say, well, what if there is something that is really urgent and really important? Well, you know, people will probably come and find you, or somebody will probably give you a call if it is super urgent and important. So what's really key is being explicit about how you manage your time and making sure that you don't sort of get distracted with all the things that people interrupted you with and thinking about the things that you need to do that nobody is asking you to do. Now, one of the most powerful words that you can learn in this leadership journey of managing time is actually no. So in your role, it might feel like you always have to say yes. But when you say yes, you're actually also saying no to something else implicitly. You're saying no to preserving your own time. You're saying no to dealing with your own sort of personal time that you need for your own sort of sanity. And this is where you have to really be conscious about how you manage tasks. Does this task need doing by you or need coordination by you? If not, say no. Maybe no is not the right word. Perhaps it's really about no, not yet. We'll deal with it next week. And this is where you have to be a lot more explicit and being comfortable of saying the word no. This matrix is called the Eisenhower matrix, and I'd really encourage all of you to start thinking about how do you use this to really make the use of your time. So one of the sort of tips that I've learned over time is actually trying to work out how do you aggregate things in your calendar and have explicit blockers to make sure you can focus on the things that you have. So for instance, a lot of tech leads, when they first step into this role, often find that they're context switching, they're not having enough time to actually sit with a team and do some code. If it's that important for you, block out some time in your calendar and decline meetings. Other people's meetings calendars can shift as well. If you're having time, if you're struggling to find time thinking about how do you learn about the people on your sort of team, block out time in your calendar in advance to do one-on-ones and get to learn a little bit more about the people who you're working with and who you're leading. If it's important, make the time for it. And this is exactly the thing that Eisenhower is trying to teach us all. Now, the final lesson around the sort of technical leadership journey is really thinking about this mental model of moving from what I call maker mode, of being that individual contributor, to being the multiplier that you can. And often the skills that you have that sort of equip you for this, when you've been working as an engineer, don't really equip you for this sort of technical leadership journey. And I hope that I've sort of shared a few tips along the way that will help you be a multiplier. But this key message, if you say to yourself, how do I measure myself and my success? You don't. You measure how well your team is doing and how successful they are. And the more successful that you make them, the better you are as an individual. So we've gone on this journey of really trying to understand the archetypical story of how people move into this role. We've learned exactly what I mean by a tech lead and learned about the surprises and struggles that people have when they first fall into this role. And hopefully you've learned a couple of tips along the way that help you be a really great tech lead in whatever you do, and some lessons learned along the way. Now, to sort of summarize some of the things that I think will be the keys to growth, and leadership journeys never really end, is really thinking about that this role is not a step up in the career ladder, but it really is a role change. And this role change requires new skills that you may not have developed as an engineer. So work out what leadership skills that you miss, invest in them, and grow them. And take comfort that others have already been on this journey, so there's a wealth of information out there, much more than there was 10 years ago, about how to do this and how to do this well. And make sure that you tap into those resources that are available. And finally, really take this mental model shift from moving away from what you do personally and moving away from maker to this multiplier role. Thank you. We have some time for questions if anybody has anything. I can't really see, so I'm not so sure if we could turn the lights on. Do you have a question? Sorry? Oh, okay. Could we turn the audience lights on, please?
Okay, thanks. So Where is the gap between manager and experienced tech lead, in your opinion? How do you not become one or the other, or maybe it's a just natural course, assuming that you can be a good manager?
So I think managers, so every organization's a bit different, and so sometimes you have people who are called tech lead managers, sometimes you have engineering managers that are actually overlapping with a tech lead role, and so every organization has a different definition of that. So for us, what we talk about engineering management is really about sort of people, process, and the environment, and the key difference is tech leads, for instance, are people who are making decisions about architecture and technical choices that have big impact. This is where engineering managers need to sort of support teams in sort of staffing and making sure that teams can sort of deliver from project planning. But this is where we make the difference, at least, and this is where it's a bit more difficult in a lot of other organizations where it's maybe not so clear.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah, so for me, I think managers are people who are very focused on, you manage the sort of structure of the system, but leading, you lead people. So this is the thing, is that you don't manage people, you lead people. And this is where tech leads, for me, are really focused on sort of leading the technical vision, the architecture, and sort of growing people technically. And then engineering managers are very much focused on the environment of how do they grow and how can they do that well.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. There's one question at the back there. Yeah, I can hear you. How did I make the animations of the presentation? Big fan of Keynote. Magic Move is the killer transition. You're welcome.
Well, first of all, I think that most of your presentation was quite relevant for architects too. That's my most interesting thing. But my question is, how would you place in this kind of organization when tech lead is actually managing some part of architecture? Would you place architects somewhere there?
So the question about, I guess, how different are tech leads from architects, and I think the thing for me is architects are hands-on people. So I do a different talk, and you can see it online too, called The Well-Rounded Architect. And this is where, for me, architects are effectively tech leads. So architects need to be sort of hands-on. They need to understand the problems that people have, and they also need to lead people as well. So I think the role of an architect has maybe fallen out of favor. So as an industry, I think we talk less about architects as a role. We talk about architecture, and we all should, because everyone contributes to architecture. So what becomes a difficult to change decision becomes architecturally significant, and every developer can make that either intentionally or unintentionally. So I think everyone should learn about architecture, but I think this is the question of, you don't necessarily always need that architect role, but this is where you do need a tech lead role to make sure everyone's moving in the same sort of direction. So I'm a big believer that everyone on a team should own architecture, and as long as somebody is thinking about the direction of architecture, you don't necessarily need that role of an architect. But in most organizations, a tech lead is kind of this architect role. Where do I see the tech leader in the Scrum process? It's a good question. So Scrum, I guess, is like I think they call it a framework. And they don't really mention a lot about technical practices. And so this is where, for me, Scrum is an additive thing. So it's a starting point that might help your team. I still think every organization that is dealing with teams of engineers needs some sort of tech lead role. So I think it's one of those things where it's quite different if you're working in an organization with just 2 engineers, and then you can just get along and make sort of decisions. But when you work at a big scale and impact, and you need more sort of coordination, you need somebody to focus on alignment. And this is where I think you need alignment around the technical vision. And this is where I think that tech lead role is really key. I'd also say that, for instance, like extreme programming doesn't really mention anything about a tech lead role. They talk about a system metaphor, which kind of dropped out in version 2 of extreme programming. But I think it's really key that somebody is worrying and sort of keeping and cultivating this alive, and making sure that there's alignment along the way. Because I think, as you all probably have known, it's like if you've worked on teams where nobody or everyone is responsible, often nobody is responsible, and then those things sort of fall out. So regardless of what Scrum says, I still think the role is key. You might think about it being played by maybe 2 people, but I wouldn't necessarily distribute it across the entire team. Cool. I think we're out of time, but thank you very much. Enjoy the break, and thank you.